The blood trail ended at his well. Tobias Hartwell had seen his share of wounded things on this dry, godforsaken land. Deer snagged on barbed wire, coyotes limping from gunfire. But this trail was different, thicker, human. When he rounded the corner of his barn, rifle raised from instinct, he expected a trespasser at worst. What he found froze him in place. A young native man slumped against the cold stone of the well, one hand clutched to his side, crimson soaking through leather and flesh. The other hand trembled, reaching not for a weapon, but for the wooden bucket swaying just inches out of reach. His face was pale, his lips cracked, eyes sunken but alert, scanning Tobias, not with hatred but desperation. The kind Tobias hadn't seen since the drought of '44. Back when even good men wept at the sight of a cloudless sky. It was 1847. And in this stretch of New Mexico territory, giving aid to an Indian was no different than putting a noose around your own neck. His neighbors would tell him to pull the trigger. His brother in Boston would call him soft. But Tobias didn't move. The man whispered, barely audible, "Water." Tobias hesitated, then lowered the rifle. He drew the bucket and pressed it to the man's lips. He didn't know who the stranger was, but as the man drank like a creature saved from fire, Tobias knew something else with absolute certainty. Whatever line he'd just crossed, there was no going back. And the next 24 hours would change everything. The warrior drank 3 full buckets before his hands could steady the rim. Each gulp was a defiance of death. Tobias watched in silence, haunted by the knowledge that he'd already done something no man in this territory would forgive. Mercy out here was dangerous. Then he saw the wound, not a gash from a wild animal, not a scrape from falling off a horse, a bullet hole, close range, the flesh around it blackened by powder. Someone had meant to kill this man, and judging by the blood trail, they might still be tracking him. The warrior, though weak, raised a shaking hand and gestured to the horizon, then slowly drew a finger across his own throat. Tobias understood. They were coming. He looked around. His barn, his fences, the land he'd worked with, blistered hands for a decade, all of it now felt like kindling. His ranch wasn't just home anymore. It was a target. He could still end it, hide the body, say nothing, sleep safe. But the man couldn't even walk, and if Tobias left him there, both of them would be corpses by sundown. That's when he heard them hoofbeats. Faint but fast, he turned to the wind. Dust. Horses. 6 at least. The warrior tried to vanish into the well shadow, as if shrinking would save him. Blood soaked his side. The dirt was already betraying them. Tobias grabbed a bucket and tossed water over the trail, scrubbing the evidence as fast as he could. But it was like hiding fire with paper. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer. He made his decision. There was an old root cellar behind the barn, a pit of darkness under a slatted door. If they could make it there, maybe he could... No. The warrior gripped his wrist, eyes wide, and shook his head. Then he smiled. Not a thank you, not relief. It was something else. Recognition. As if he knew exactly who was riding over that ridge, and exactly why. They came over the ridge like a dust storm, 6 riders, rifles glinting, eyes sharp. At their head was Marshal Dixon Webb, the lawman with blood on his boots and no room for questions in his justice. Tobias recognized him instantly. Everyone did. Webb didn't keep peace. He manufactured fear. The other riders fanned out, forming a half moon, hands resting near pistols. This was no patrol. Webb reined in just 10 feet from Tobias. "Afternoon, Hartwell," he drawled, voice slow like dripping molasses. "We're tracking a wounded savage. Blood trail ends at your gate." Tobias forced his mouth to work. "Ain't seen no one. Been fixing fence posts all day." Webb's gaze scanned the ranch. Nothing missed his eye. And when it landed on the damp soil by the well, his lips curled. "That's so?" he said, dismounting. "'Cause that sure looks like blood. Fresh." He stepped forward, hand now openly resting on the handle of his pistol. "You know the penalty for harboring Indian fugitives?" Tobias nodded once. "Same as treason." "Exactly." Behind him, the wounded warrior lay perfectly still, hidden by the stone wall. One breath, one cough, and they were both dead men. Webb took another step. Then a sound cut through the standoff. The Indian spoke, not in English. In his own tongue, words Tobias didn't understand, but didn't need to. They were sharp, rhythmic, intentional, and they changed everything. Marshal Webb stopped mid-step. His face, the face Tobias had seen sneer at wounded prisoners and laugh at bar fights, went white. He stared toward the well, unmoving. "Dear God," he whispered, "you're him." The deputies exchanged looks. One stepped back. Another's eyes darted toward the hills as if calculating escape. Tobias blinked. "Who is he?" The Indian's voice, now hoarse but clear, answered in English. "Tell him, Marshal. Tell him why you rode so hard." Webb looked like a man trapped between ghosts. "Ayanna," he said, "son of Chief Dakota, the one who negotiated the peace treaty with Fort Richardson." Tobias staggered a step back. He remembered the treaty. Everyone did. It was the only reason his ranch hadn't burned last year. And now the man who made that peace was bleeding at his feet with a bullet in his gut. Tobias couldn't breathe. He had watered a dying man, not realizing he'd offered mercy to the very figure holding the fragile threads of peace together. Ayanna's voice, though strained, carried weight. "There was an ambush. 3 days ago I was meeting Colonel Morrison to expand the treaty, but Morrison never intended peace." Webb flinched. "Morrison's dead, shot in the back during an Indian raid." "No," Ayanna said, pressing against the well stone for support. "Killed by men in war paint, men who spoke just enough Apache to fool witnesses." Tobias felt it like a blow, the betrayal coiling through every word. "They staged it," Ayanna continued. "Framed me? Because peace doesn't fill pockets. War does." Webb's jaw tightened. "That's a serious accusation. And it'll stay an accusation," Ayanna rasped, "unless I make it to the Apache Council tomorrow." Behind Webb, one of the younger deputies shifted. "Marshal, if he's telling the truth, shut your mouth, Bradley." But the silence that followed wasn't agreement. It was doubt. Thick and rising. Ayanna reached into a pouch, pulled out a blood-stained letter. "Colonel Morrison wrote this the night he died. Names, payments, the men selling rifles to renegade tribes." Webb didn't even reach for it. His eyes were fixed on something far worse, the truth. "And one name," Ayanna added, voice like stone, "inside the territorial marshal's office." A tremor passed through Webb's hand. His skin had gone ash-gray. "You're lying," he said, but his voice betrayed him. "No," Ayanna said, "and I'll make you a deal. Let me reach the council. You won't be named." Webb's eyes flicked to his men. Too late. Deputy Bradley dismounted. "Marshal, remember that missing rifle shipment? The one we blamed on Indians?" Webb turned slowly. "What about it?" "I saw those rifles. In settler wagons. 2 weeks later." It shattered the silence like glass. The other deputies exchanged glances. Murmurs. Realizations. The truth wasn't just spoken now, it was spreading. Ayanna had turned Webb's own men against him without firing a single shot. And Tobias stood in the middle of it all, a rancher caught between bullets and betrayal, between the lies men kill to protect and the truth that can save them all. Marshal Webb's hand twitched at his side, hovering near his pistol, not from confidence, but fear. "You're all fools," he snapped, voice cracking under the strain. "You think this savage's word means anything against mine? You think anyone will believe the testimony of a dying Indian and a handful of traitors? No one moved. Then Ayana, barely standing, began to sing. A low, ancient melody in Apache, not loud but powerful. It rose like smoke, winding between men and horses, curling into the dusk. The words were foreign, but they stirred something deeper than understanding. It was a song of memory, of ancestors, of blood spilled and promises made. The deputies froze. Even Webb's fingers loosened on his weapon. Tobias had never heard anything like it. It wasn't just a song, it was a call, a signal. Ayana wasn't pleading for help. He was summoning it. The wind shifted. And in that silence, the earth began to whisper. Hoofbeats. Faint at first, but fast. Dozens of them. Tobias felt it in the soles of his boots, a vibration that climbed through his bones. Webb paled. How many? He demanded. Ayana's lips curved into a tired smile. Enough. Then the horizon cracked open. Not 6, not a dozen, but 50 Apache warriors came thundering over the ridge like a storm let loose from heaven, war paint gleaming, horses in perfect formation. At their head rode a silver-haired chief, regal and commanding, Chief Takota, Ayana's father. The tribe didn't attack. They surrounded. Not to threaten, but to bear witness. The trap wasn't for Ayana. It was for Webb. And Tobias had unknowingly helped set it. The circle of warriors parted as Chief Takota dismounted. He walked slow, every step heavy with dignity and thunderous silence. His eyes never left his son, not once. And when they reached each other, there was no fanfare, no ceremony, just a long, quiet embrace that spoke of survival, pride, and relief. Tobias stood transfixed. This wasn't a war party. It was a father reclaiming his wounded son and a people standing behind truth. Takota turned to Webb. His voice, when it came, was smooth and precise. Marshal Webb, my son tells me you came here to murder him. Webb's pistol was still raised, but now the hand holding it trembled. I came here to arrest a fugitive. A fugitive from your own corruption, the chief replied. His only crime was discovering how you profit from the blood of our people. The words dropped like axes into the dirt. Webb's last loyal deputy, Hawkins, began backing away, trying to slip free from the noose tightening around them all. You have no proof. Webb barked, but even he didn't sound convinced. The chief lifted one hand, and a warrior rode forward, carrying a weathered satchel. From it, he drew a stack of papers, letters, receipts, ledgers. Your deals with the gunrunners, Takota said. Every shipment, every coin. Colonel Morrison documented it all more thoroughly than you ever imagined. Webb's face collapsed into horror. Tobias saw it clearly, the realization that every backroom deal, every dirty bounty, every drop of blood Webb thought buried was now evidence. Then came the final blow. Ayana reached into his shirt and produced the blood-stained letter. Morrison's final words, he said. Names, bribes, testimonies, including your own signature, Marshal. Webb's world cracked, and Tobias knew the gun didn't matter anymore. Webb had already lost. But a cornered man is still dangerous. Webb's eyes flared wild. If I'm going down, he snarled, I'm taking someone with me. In one violent motion, he spun not toward Ayana, but toward the chief. His pistol fired, but Ayana, half collapsing, threw himself between the bullet and his father. The shot rang out across the ranch like a crack of judgment, and chaos followed. 50 Apache warriors reached for their weapons in perfect unity. But before another shot could be fired, Webb was tackled to the ground. Tobias, the rancher who had only meant to give a dying man some water, now had his arms locked around the marshal, dragging him into the dust, wresting the pistol from his hand. The dust settled like ash. Webb lay pinned, face scraped and twisted in rage, weaponless and panting. Deputy Bradley rushed in, gun drawn, voice steady. It's over. One by one, the other deputies moved not toward Tobias, but toward their marshal. They disarmed him. They restrained Hawkins. And just like that, the line was drawn. But it wasn't over for Tobias. As he sat in the dirt, catching his breath, Chief Dakota stepped forward, tall, silent, a mountain of presence. Without a word, he placed both hands on Tobias's shoulders. He spoke in Apache. The tone was ceremonial, ancient, final. Ayanna translated, his voice thick with meaning. He says, "You are now brother to our people. That mercy in the face of fear is the mark of a true warrior." Tobias felt it, not pride, not fear, but transformation. All his life, he had believed what he'd been told, that Indians were enemies, savages. But here, surrounded by the very people he was taught to hate, he saw only dignity, gratitude, and something else, honor. The ceremony began without instruction. One by one, the Apache warriors dismounted, forming a circle around Tobias. They approached slowly, not with handshakes, but by touching his arm, his shoulder, his chest, each gesture simple yet sacred. A silent recognition of what he had done. Not just the risk, not just the mercy, but the refusal to turn away when every voice told him to. And when the last warrior had stepped back, Chief Dakota lifted something wrapped in dawskin and unfurled it with reverence. A war lance. Its shaft polished smooth by time, adorned with eagle feathers, bone carvings, and beadwork that shimmered in the setting sun. "This belonged to my grandfather," the chief said, "and his grandfather before him. It has never left Apache hands." He paused, then offered it to Tobias. "Until today." Tobias stared at the weapon, unsure whether to accept. But his hands moved before his doubts could. When he grasped the lance, it felt heavier than iron, not in weight, but in meaning. As the sun sank behind the buttes, bathing the ranch in crimson and gold, the Apache prepared to depart. Ayanna's wound had been treated with herbal poultices wrapped tight with care. Though still weak, he stood beside his father now, proud and alive. Before he mounted, Ayanna turned to Tobias, clasped his hand, and said, "You didn't just save my life, you saved a future. For all of us." Tobias gave a half-smile. "I just gave a man some water." Ayanna's grin deepened. Sometimes that's how the world changes. Then the warriors rode out, not as shadows in the night, but as figures etched into light, leaving the ranch not in flames, but in peace. By the next morning, the ranch was still and quiet again, just whined over sagebrush and the creak of old fence posts. But everything had changed. The world didn't return to what it had been. Word spread fast. Within a week, Tobias's name was on every tongue, from Santa Fe to the Brazos. Some called him brave, others called him a fool, but none denied what had happened. Marshal Webb and his deputy Hawkins were shackled and led to stand trial, not in some distant courtroom, but under the full scrutiny of both U.S. law and Apache witness. The evidence was overwhelming. Morrison's letter, the payment records, and testimonies from settlers and tribes alike. The verdict came fast: treason, corruption, conspiracy to commit murder. They were sentenced to life spared, the noose perhaps, but not the shame. The arms smuggling ring that had poisoned the territory for years crumbled overnight. The gun runners scattered. And the peace treaty Ayanna had nearly died to protect. It was renewed and expanded, not just Fort Richardson, but all outposts across the Southern Territories signed on. New negotiations began. The violence that had haunted both settler and native for generations found at last a pause. But Tobias didn't ride east to tell his brother. He didn't seek reward or title. He stayed right where he was, on the same land, with the same well, under the same sky. But now he belonged to two worlds. Weeks later, Ayana returned not with warriors, but with parchment, a document of formal adoption into the Apache Nation, signed by the council, sealed with the marks of chiefs and elders. Tobias Hartwell, once just a rancher with calloused hands and quiet eyes, had become the first white man in territorial history to be accepted into their tribe. And he hadn't earned it with a rifle, he'd earned it with water. The war lance rested above Tobias's hearth from that day forward, not as a trophy, but as a reminder, a symbol of what he almost didn't do, of what nearly died with a pull of a trigger. He never spoke much about that day, never claimed heroism, never corrected the stories that twisted around him like prairie vines. But those who visited his ranch noticed a quiet reverence in how he lived, a gentleness in his voice, a stillness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. And on certain mornings when the sun broke across the mesas just right, he could be seen walking to the well, pausing there, one hand resting on the stone, as if listening for a memory caught in the wind. He'd stay there a while, sometimes smiling, sometimes not. The townsfolk eventually stopped calling him crazy behind his back. The stories changed. First came settlers from nearby counties, seeking his advice on treaty dealings. Then young braves sent by Dakota himself to learn English, learn farming, learn coexistence. His ranch had become something strange and rare in the Old West, neutral ground, and though Tobias never asked for it, that land became sacred to more people than he would ever meet. The day he received an eagle feather from the Apache Council placed in his hand by Ayana's own son, he wept. Not loudly, just enough for the boy to notice and nod in silence. He wasn't a leader, wasn't a preacher. He was a man who'd made one choice when it counted, and that choice rippled outward like water dropped into stillness. In the brutal wilds of the West, where dust buried names and silence marked graves, it wasn't bullets or blood that changed the course of history that day. It was water, a single cup, offered to a man who was supposed to be an enemy. There had been no certainty, no prophecy, just instinct, the human kind, the kind that says, he's thirsty, help him. And maybe that's the lesson the land had been trying to teach all along, that in a place carved by violence, it's not strength that endures, but mercy. Tobias Hartwell never fired a shot, never raised his voice, but in that moment by the well, he rewrote the ending to a story that was meant to end in blood. He didn't do it with speeches or strategy. He did it by seeing past the color of a man's skin, past the rumors, past the fear, and choosing compassion when everything else demanded hate. And somehow that was enough. They say the West was tamed by steel, grit, and fire, but sometimes it bent for something far quieter. A hand extended, a voice lowered, a well shared. And in those moments, rare, flickering like fireflies before dusk, history didn't move with the weight of guns, but with the grace of a simple gesture. Ayana's wound healed. The treaty endured. And somewhere on a quiet ranch, the son of a chief and a rancher, once called fool, remained brothers long after the world stopped watching. Because mercy leaves a mark deeper than fear ever could. Tobias Hartwell never asked to be remembered. But among the Apache, his name is still spoken not as legend, not as myth, but as a reminder that even in a land where trust had been burned to ash, one man's courage to offer water without condition, without demand, was enough to bring peace where none should have been possible. And sometimes that's all the West ever needed,